They laughed about my old debt for years, until the day I brought the papers that ended it. That's how this story begins, not with shouting or chaos, but with a quiet moment when something inside me finally refused to bend. For most of my life, every family gathering came with the same predictable joke, tossed across the table with light laughter. Remember that money you owed? Remember how we saved you? It wasn't meant to wound, or so they claimed. But the truth is, even gentle jokes can bruise when they're repeated often enough. What no one knew, not until much later, was that the check my grandfather wrote me years ago had become the center of their favorite story. A story they'd rewritten to make me look small. A story they believed would never change. But the thing about quiet people, the kind who absorb, endure, and keep going, is that one day, without fireworks or warning, they choose a different path. And when they do, the shift is subtle, clean, and irreversible. This story unfolds in those subtle shifts, in documents printed under a warm desk lamp, in a boundary stated without raising a voice, in a move made not out of anger but alignment. It's about what happens when someone stops waiting to be understood and starts living in the clarity they've built for themselves. If you've ever carried a truth no one else believed, if you've ever been the quiet one everyone underestimated, then you'll understand why this ending is nothing like they expected. Stay with me, because once the truth arrived, everything else moved with it. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories like this, quiet, powerful, and deeply human. He handed me the envelope the way someone sets down a fragile ornament. Careful, almost ceremonial. The living room glowed with that soft holiday hush, the kind that makes every movement feel louder than it is. When I slid my thumb under the flap, the paper check slipped out like it had been waiting for air. Its edge caught the light from the tree, a pale shimmer that made me pause. I opened it with both hands, the way you hold something you're not sure you're allowed to want. My breath stayed stuck somewhere behind my ribs, steady enough to keep my fingers from shaking, but not steady enough to feel natural. Around me, wrapping paper crackled. Someone laughed too loudly at a joke I'd missed, and yet all I heard was the dry whisper of that check, settling against my palm. It shouldn't have meant anything, not really, but I felt something shift, subtle as a draft across the back of my neck. Something like possibility, something like warning. And then the room returned, all at once, as if I'd stepped out only for a heartbeat. My parents exchanged one of those practiced glances, quick, flat, sharpened by years of being on the same side of a joke only they understood. Dad chuckled first, that low knowing sound he used whenever he wanted the room to follow his lead. "Just an old man's Christmas prank," he said, waving a hand as if the check were a novelty card you buy at a gas station. Mom smirked, adding a soft, "Don't take it seriously, sweetheart. It's just for fun." I kept my face still, tucking the check into my wallet with a deliberate calm that felt borrowed rather than owned. My thumb pressed against the leather edge, holding it in place like I could pin the moment down long enough to understand it. They had always used humor like a rug, pretty on the surface, meant to cover what shouldn't be seen. Maybe this was no different. Maybe it really was nothing. But the paper had weight. I felt it, even after it disappeared inside the dark pocket of my wallet. I wasn't sure whether they expected me to laugh or blush. I did neither. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said quietly. Just 6 words, simple, even gentle, but the room shifted around them. Not dramatically, nothing that would catch a stranger's eye, just a small, nearly imperceptible pause, as though every sound stumbled for half a second before continuing on. He looked at me with something soft flickering in his expression, a warmth that didn't need explanation. No one else seemed to hear what I meant inside those words, but he did. He always had a way of catching the quieter things people overlooked. The check rested against my wallet's spine, more present than any gift wrapped under the tree. And my voice, steady, controlled, felt like the first line drawn in sand I hadn't realized I was standing on. Inside my chest, my heartbeat tapped like someone testing a door they weren't sure was locked. Not frantic, not fearful, just persistent, curious, like a rhythm reminding me of something I'd forgotten to pay attention to. It echoed against a part of me that had been quiet for too long, the part that noticed the small imbalances, the jokes that weren't really jokes, the way financial help always came with strings so thin you didn't feel them until you moved the wrong way. I didn't know what this check would become. I only knew I felt more awake than I had moments before, as though someone had cracked open a window inside me, and I couldn't unhear that knock anymore. The scent of pine from the Christmas tree mixed with the faint sweetness of cinnamon cookies cooling on the counter. The fireplace popped, sending a thin line of sparks skittering upward before fading into the chimney's dark throat. Cold fog pressed stubbornly against the window panes, turning the outside world into a blurred watercolor. My fingertips cooled against the wallet's smooth leather, the check tucked inside like a quiet ember. A strand of garland brushed my shoulder when I shifted, its plastic needles prickling lightly against my sweater. All around me, the house hummed with familiar December warmth, the kind that looked perfect from the outside. But under that warmth, beneath the soft lights and glittering ornaments, something in the air felt different, thinner, expectant, as if the season itself were holding its breath. They nudged the envelope back toward me during cleanup, the way someone returns a misplaced napkin rather than a gift. Mom laughed lightly, waving her hand as if brushing off an invisible speck of dust. "Just keep it for amusement," she said. "Your grandfather loves these little stunts." Dad chimed in, tone breezy. "You know him. Christmas gets him sentimental." His words floated over the table, light and harmless on the surface, but with an undertow I'd grown too familiar with. They wanted it to be a joke. They wanted me to treat it like a prop in a family play I never auditioned for. I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled a receipt from my bag, a grocery run from 2 days ago, and wrote the check amount along its margin. The pen moved in steady strokes, each number slow and intentional. If they wanted it to be nothing, I needed to see it clearly first. The room bustled with dishes clinking, chairs scraping, voices overlapping. I let the chaos wash past me and focused on that scrap of paper, the ink still drying. Their dismissal didn't sting. It settled deeper, quieter, like a splinter you only notice when you touch the wrong spot. I folded the check down to a neat square, creasing its edges until it fit perfectly between my fingers. The signature at the bottom, his handwriting, small and shaky, caught my eye again. A tremor in the ink, a tiny wobble in the tail of his last name. It wasn't a prank. Not from him. Across the room, laughter flared again. Someone retold a story about an old holiday mishap, and everyone leaned in, chasing the warmth of shared nostalgia. But I stayed where I was, thumb resting against the folded check, the paper softening slightly under my touch. He had slipped it into the envelope with intention. Even if my parents insisted otherwise, he hadn't meant it as a joke. That knowledge sat between my ribs like a fragile truth, small enough to hide yet impossible to ignore. I slid the check into my wallet, smoothing the leather over it. For a moment, the weight of it felt almost like a pulse, quiet, steady, undeniably there. And in the middle of a loud, busy room, I felt strangely, sharply alone with that certainty. "Okay, it's fine," I murmured. Just 3 words, spoken lightly, as if agreeing to a harmless suggestion. But under them lived something else, an acknowledgement of the roles we all played in this familiar routine. They heard my words the way they wanted to, agreeable, unobtrusive, willing to move on. But inside, they felt like a boundary drawn with the thinnest pencil line. I didn't look up immediately. My thumb pressed the wallet closed, holding the check in place. Across the table, someone asked Mom a question, and the conversation bounced on, unbothered by my quiet. I lifted my head only after the moment had passed. No one noticed the shift. That, somehow, made it clearer. I've learned over the years how to wrap silence around myself like a winter scarf. Soft, unobtrusive, protective in ways no one else sees. It keeps my thoughts from spilling where they don't belong, and shields me from the sting of words meant to be light-hearted. Inside, though, the silence held more than warmth. It held a vacancy that shouldn't have been there, the kind that comes from being reduced to a punchline in your own life. The check wasn't the wound. The dismissal was. The subtle flattening of meaning, the assumption that nothing they gave me could carry weight unless they decided it should. I swallowed that familiar mix of steadiness and ache, folding it into the same quiet place where I kept so many small grievances. They collected there like lint, insignificant individually, but together, enough to make a seam pull. And I felt one tug now. A thread of cold drifted through the mesh screen door, curling around my ankles before dissolving into the warmth of the room. I glanced toward the porch. Its light spilled a soft amber across the damp welcome mat, catching glints in the rain that had begun to fall again. Inside, the scent of roasted herbs clung to the air. My fingers brushed my jeans, where a faint smudge of ink remained from the receipt. A few crumbs dotted the tablecloth, remnants of a meal that felt both comforting and suffocating at once. The room's chatter rose and fell like waves, sometimes near enough to touch, sometimes drifting far away. Yet that pulse of cold air at my feet lingered, reminding me that something outside this house felt freer than the space I occupied in it. I adjusted my seat, letting my heel press firmly against the floor. A grounding gesture, a quiet claim. The check did nothing, but the way they dismissed it, that left a mark. Later that night, when the house had exhaled into its usual December stillness, I pulled the check from my wallet and set it flat on the kitchen table. The overhead light hummed softly, a thin electric drone that made the room feel more awake than I felt. I snapped a photo of the check, front, back, close-up of the date. Then I opened the banking app tied to my grandfather's account, the one he'd once asked me to help him navigate. I dialed the branch number listed on the back. The line rang twice, then a polite voice answered. I asked for verification, keeping my tone measured, giving the amount, the check number, the issuing account. As I waited, pen poised above a blank page, the quiet stretched just long enough to make me wonder whether I was imagining all of this. When the confirmation came, funds available, legitimate issue, I nodded even though no one could see me. I wrote the time of the call on the page, the pen's tip leaving a crisp dot at the end. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Just facts aligning themselves in a row. And suddenly the check wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. I saved the verification email immediately, dragging it into a folder I titled Ledger, with a precision that steadied me more than I expected. One by one, I added the photos, phone log, timestamp. Each upload landed in place like bricks. Small, square, quiet, undeniably solid. It wasn't suspicion that drove me. It was clarity. When people in my family dismissed something, it tended to disappear. Not by magic, but by momentum. Conversation moved on. History bent. Memory softened around the edges. Truth lost its shape unless someone held it. So I held it. I labeled each file with the kind of care usually reserved for tax forms or official letters. My handwriting stayed firm. No hesitation. The check wasn't just a gift or a joke anymore. It was a starting point, a reference, evidence, even if I didn't yet know of what. Stacking those details gave me a strange sense of footing. like standing on something that had been shaky for years but was finally leveling under my weight. I didn't know what path I was laying, only that the ground beneath it felt steadier than the room I'd left hours earlier. "I just need confirmation," I'd told the banker. 5 words, practical and calm, but inside them was a truth I hadn't said aloud. I needed something that wasn't shifting under someone else's interpretation. I needed one piece of this night to belong to fact, not performance. Even over the phone, the banker had responded with a tone that carried no judgment, no surprise, just process. Clear, neutral process. Something inside me eased at that. Paperwork doesn't wink. Databases don't smirk. Numbers don't tease you about taking things too seriously. When the line clicked off, the silence around me felt different. Like the air had settled into place, and for the first time that evening, I felt aligned with something unbothered by anyone's opinion. Caution has never been dramatic for me. It's more like a coat you forget you're wearing until someone points out its weight. I've never minded that. Practicality has a way of insulating you from the drafts of other people's inconsistencies. As I reviewed the notes I'd taken, the confirmation number, the timestamp, I felt a kind of quiet assurance. Not triumph, not even satisfaction, just steadiness. A reminder that preparedness isn't paranoia, it's protection. I'd spent years learning to live inside other people's narratives, bending myself into shapes that made things easier, smoother, quieter. But the check's authenticity pressed back against that habit. It was a small truth, but it was mine, unmarred by anyone else's laughter. A single verified fact can do that, nudge you gently back into your own alignment. And as I stared at the page, I realized how much I'd missed that feeling. The ceiling fan above me turned with a tired groan, its blades circling slowly, like they were moving through thickened air. A faint draft brushed my wrist, cool against the table's polished wood. My pen rested beside the check, its metal body cold enough to make me lift my fingers. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator's steady hum. Even the street outside seemed muted, as if wrapped in a layer of winter fog thick enough to blur sound. I sat with that stillness, letting it settle around me. The check remained on the table, its edges crisp, the ink slightly raised where my grandfather's pen had pressed too hard. I traced the curve of his signature with my eyes, remembering the careful way he held a pen, how he paused before writing anything important. The small details sharpened the moment. Cool metal, warm wood, soft hums, slow air. They grounded me more than any holiday chatter had earlier. And for the first time since the envelope appeared, I felt like I was looking at something honest. The post office was nearly empty by the time I arrived. Just the faint smell of cardboard, the echo of distant sorting machines, and a clerk who looked like he'd been waiting all evening for someone to break the silence. I stepped aside near the small metal counter and opened my banking app. The fluorescent lights above hummed in a steady rhythm, washing the room in a pale, almost clinical glow. I held the check flat with one hand, angled my phone with the other, pressing gently to keep the edges from curling. The app recognized it on the first try. A clean image, then another. I submitted the mobile deposit, watching the loading circle spin once, twice. I checked the details twice more, amount, date, endorsement, before hitting confirm. My phone vibrated in a soft buzz, a quiet acknowledgement that the action was complete. I stood still for a moment, letting the finality of it wash over me. No announcements, no ceremony, just a silent transaction in a nearly empty room at the edge of a winter night. It felt right that such a pivotal choice happened quietly. I forwarded the confirmation email to myself, saving a copy in the same folder where I'd stored the verification. Then, with a small swipe, I sent the screenshots of the deposit to a subfolder marked Evidence, 10:42 p.m. the timestamp crisp against the screen like the thin line drawn between start and direction. Labels mattered. Order mattered. When the world around you bends meaning, organization becomes a kind of armor. Each file slid into place with a soft digital click that steadied me more than any comforting words could have. The clerk behind the counter cleared his throat, not to hurry me, but simply because humans do that in quiet rooms. I tucked my phone into my coat pocket, feeling its warmth against the cold air settling around my legs. Everything was documented now, verified, recorded, preserved in a place no one could laugh away. Standing there, I felt something subtle but unmistakable. A shift. A small door opening, not dramatic but certain. And for once, I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder to confirm it. "It's done. Thank you," I whispered almost to myself. The words left my mouth simply, without any flourish. They weren't directed at the clerk, or at the phone, or even at the check now safely transferred into the system. It was more like a quiet acknowledgement to the moment itself, a nod to the fact that something had crossed a line from possibility into fact. The air seemed to take my words in without reaction, absorbing them the way winter absorbs sound. A soft acceptance. A small affirmation. No one around me needed to understand what I meant. I knew. That was enough. As I stepped outside, the cold bit at my cheeks, sharp enough to keep me present. I felt the shift in my chest, the same steadying calm that comes when the first piece of a plan clicks into place. Not adrenaline, not defiance, just clarity. A kind of inward alignment that made breathing feel easier. I wasn't building anything grand or vengeful. I was simply setting something right, brick by quiet brick. The deposit wasn't about money, it was about proof. It was about choosing not to be gaslit by laughter disguised as love. It was about deciding that if I was going to move forward, I'd do it with facts in hand, not wishes. The night felt less heavy as I walked toward my car, the steps measured, unhurried. I didn't need certainty about the whole journey, just the next step. Tonight, that step had been taken. A damp metallic scent clung to the air near the drop box, the kind that always follows a cold front moving through. I brushed my fingertips against the edge of my coat pocket, feeling the faint vibration linger from the earlier notification. The pavement beneath my boots glistened where thin traces of melted frost caught the streetlight. My breath drifted out in a slow plume, dissolving upward like a quiet exhale from the world itself. I paused beside my car door, allowing the moment to settle fully around me. The paper from earlier, the envelope, the check, the receipt, was gone now. Only digital traces remained, light, but permanent. Sometimes permanence doesn't feel heavy. Sometimes it feels like a hand resting gently at the center of your back, urging you forward. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the cold nip at my lashes. This was the first step that belonged only to me. Back home, I cleared a spot on the small dining table, pushing aside a stack of unopened mail and the grocery list I'd half-written earlier in the week. I pulled out my old statements, credit lines, payment histories, the long chain of numbers that charted years of patching holes no one else seemed to notice. With a pen, I drew lines from one balance to another, tracing how each debt had been sold, resold, bundled, and pushed forward, until my name sat at the end like a final, tired period. Red arrows marked the flow of it. Interest, fees, penalties. The whole machine that thrives on quiet people who don't push back. And every arrow pointed to me. I leaned closer, connecting one date to another, circling the pattern that had always been there but never acknowledged. How many times had I paid just enough to keep the wolves from the door, only to find a new one waiting? Each movement of the pen steadied my breath. Here, on paper, the truth wasn't slippery. It stayed put. And as the diagram grew, I realized I wasn't looking at chaos. I was looking at leverage, if I chose to use it. A memory surfaced with the ease of something long buried but never lost. I saw my grandfather crouched under the porch one summer, fixing the loose wire on the old light that flickered whenever the wind changed direction. I must have been 10, maybe 11, watching him work with slow, patient hands. He'd wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist, squinting at the bulb as it finally steadied. "Money should help you stand up straight," he'd said, as if the porch light and life itself shared the same wiring, "not make you bend." At the time, I'd nodded without understanding, but the sentence lodged itself somewhere deep, a quiet stone in my pocket I'd carried unknowingly into adulthood. That memory pressed against me now, gentle but firm. The check wasn't charity. It wasn't a prank. It was him offering me a steadier footing in a language he trusted: paper, ink, and intent. I looked back at my diagram and felt the pieces align almost audibly. Maybe this wasn't just a ledger. Maybe it was a way forward. "This is how they keep me tied," I murmured. The words slipped out without effort, a small truth rising to the surface after years of being pushed down. It wasn't an accusation, just recognition. I'd let the cycle continue because it was familiar, because it was easier to shoulder the weight quietly than risk calling attention to it. Saying it aloud felt like touching a bruise I hadn't realized was still tender. But acknowledging a trap is the first step toward finding the door. Knowledge has always been my form of safety. Not power, just understanding. The kind that lights a hallway enough to walk through it without fear of stumbling. As I studied the map I'd drawn, a calm settled over me, replacing the old swirl of shame and uncertainty that debt usually carried. There was no shame in seeing clearly, only strength. Every detail on the page, dates, percentages, scribbled notes, gave structure to something that used to feel shapeless and overwhelming. And with structure came choice. Not loud or dramatic, but steady, precise. I could move differently now. I could make decisions based on facts rather than fear. The realization didn't spark joy or relief. It just grounded me, like placing both feet firmly on a floor that finally stopped shifting. Sometimes clarity is gentler than hope. The desk lamp cast a long amber streak across the paper, warming the cool white of the statements. My fingertips brushed over the ink, feeling the faint ridges where I'd pressed too hard earlier. Outside, a cold breeze swept past the window, rattling a loose screen, sending a quick shiver up my arms. I inhaled the faint scent of old paper, the musty sweetness that comes from documents handled too often over too many years. It mingled with the smell of last night's coffee still lingering in the mug beside me. The small sounds of the house formed a quiet cocoon. The refrigerator humming, the heater clicking alive for another cycle, the soft scratch of my pen as I added one last note to the margin. In the glow of the lamp, the map of my debt looked less like a burden and more like a blueprint, something I could work with. The next morning I sat at the small kitchen table with my laptop open and my coffee cooling untouched beside me. I pulled up the number for the collection agency and pressed call, steadying my breath as the line clicked through automated menus. When a representative finally answered, I kept my voice level and deliberate. I requested a verification letter, full details itemized, dated, everything required by law but so rarely asked for. As they placed me on hold, I tapped the record button on my phone, letting it capture the call in clean, quiet lines. The hold music crackled faintly, a thin melody trying too hard to sound comforting. I stared at the snow gathering outside the window, soft flakes drifting like ash, and reminded myself that this was just a conversation, nothing more. When the agent returned, I wrote down every word, the pen moving with a measured calm. No interruptions, no emotion slipping through. This was logistics, nothing personal, nothing dramatic. By the time the call ended, I had the confirmation I needed. Not everything, but enough to pull the next thread. Clarity grows one document at a time. I called back a second time, this time to negotiate. My voice didn't waver. I laid out the offer, a settlement for a fraction of the listed balance, contingent on receiving written acknowledgement of resolution. I didn't bargain, I didn't plead. I simply stated the terms with the same tone I'd use reading ingredients off a box. The representative hesitated, typing loudly, as if the extra keystrokes might convince me to raise my offer. I didn't. I repeated my conditions. Written confirmation, same-day response. No ambiguity. The kind of clarity debt collectors rarely grant unless someone pushes with precision. I heard the shift when they realized I wasn't guessing. They asked for a few minutes to escalate the request. I agreed, checking the time and marking it down. I circled the minute on my notepad, drawing a quiet boundary, even here. When they returned with a tentative acceptance, I added a final condition: all communication in writing. A pause, then agreement. I hung up without ceremony, feeling the edges of a plan sharpen into something workable. "Please send the verification today," I said evenly. Just 7 words, but they carried a weight I didn't need to raise my voice to convey. The representative repeated the request back to me, and I confirmed it with a quiet, steady yes. No extra politeness, no softening, just clarity. The line went silent for a moment, and I could almost hear them adjusting their tone, realizing I wasn't someone they could push into confusion. People underestimate calm. They mistake it for uncertainty. But calm is just control wearing a soft coat. I ended the call with a simple farewell, letting the words settle like dust. On the inside, I held the same tremor anyone does when dealing with bureaucracy. Those small bursts of doubt that ask, what if you misstep? What if this goes wrong? But the steadiness I projected wasn't an act. It was a choice, one I had practiced for years without realizing it. I kept replaying the steps in my head: verification, negotiation, documentation. Not because I doubted them, but because repetition made the process feel less like a gamble and more like a blueprint. I didn't need to be loud. I didn't even need to be confident. I only needed to be thorough. Experience had taught me that people rarely expect quiet women to know the rules, or to use them, especially when those women have learned to fold their emotions neatly out of sight. Still, as I sat staring at the notes I'd taken, a faint throb of fear pulsed beneath my ribs. Not enough to stop me, just enough to prove I was still human. But I kept going anyway. The recording beeped softly when I stopped it, that tiny mechanical chirp that always sounded colder than it should. The phone felt cool in my hand, its smooth surface grounding me. I flipped through my notes again, checking the spelling of names, the exact phrasing of promises made, the timestamps lining the margin like a quiet scaffolding. The kitchen carried a faint draft, slipping in through the gap near the back door. It skimmed across my ankles, brushing against the legs of the chair. The heater clicked on in response, sending a muted warmth crawling back toward me. On the table, the pen I'd used lay diagonally across the page, still pointed at the last word I'd written. The ink had dried in a slightly raised line, crisp beneath my fingertip when I traced it lightly. Everything about the moment, the cool air, the warm hum, the whisper of ink, felt precise, exact, aligned. This was how truth is built, slowly, with details no one notices unless they need to. By afternoon, my dining table had transformed into a temporary command center. Documents spread out like tiles in a mosaic, laptop humming, a shallow cup of water reflecting the winter light. I opened a new tab and began drafting the payment terms. No flourishes, no unnecessary words, just the essentials. The settlement amount, the timeline, the release of the debt, the obligation to provide written confirmation of resolution. Every sentence tightened into something lean and airtight. I opened a separate account for the transaction, one I hadn't used before. A clean ledger for a clean break. The quiet efficiency of it steadied me. There was comfort in rules that didn't shift depending on someone's mood. Numbers don't pout. Terms don't tease. Paper doesn't gaslight. I reviewed everything twice, then once more, nudging a phrase here, adjusting the tone there, until the document felt like a locked door, clear, firm, impossible to misunderstand. When I finished, I clicked save and let the screen dim for a moment, giving myself space to breathe. Silent structure. That's all this was. I printed the draft and laid it flat, smoothing the page with the back of my hand. The words stared back at me with a kind of neutral authority. There was no anger in them, no accusation, only boundaries arranged with careful intention. I highlighted the requirement for written acknowledgement of debt dismissal. That was the pillar everything rested on. Without it, nothing mattered. With it, everything changed. Paper is the great equalizer. It can't be dismissed with a laugh or explained away with, "We didn't mean it like that." As I worked, I felt an odd calm settle into my shoulders. My handwriting along the margins grew neater, sharper. I adjusted spacing, added bullet points, clarified a clause. Each revision strengthened the spine of the agreement. This wasn't vengeance. It wasn't even about reclaiming dignity. It was simply a correction, a quiet shift back to what should have been obvious all along. When I stepped back and looked at the page, it felt sturdy, something that could hold its own in any light. "This is the clean version," I said softly. Hearing the words aloud grounded them. They weren't dramatic. They didn't need to carry emotion. They were the verbal equivalent of placing a stone exactly where it belonged. A statement of fact, nothing more. I held the page between my fingers, lightly tapping one corner against the table as if testing its weight. The room didn't shift. The air didn't react. Everything remained ordinary, but saying it, even quietly, felt like naming a truth that had lived unnamed for too long. The simplicity of the terms felt almost startling. I'd spent so many years bracing for complexity, for strings tucked into favors, for conditions hidden beneath kindness, for debts that grew roots in every direction, that writing something straightforward felt like stepping into a room with no furniture. There was space here, breathing room. I thought about how often I'd been told to let things go, as though letting go meant being silent rather than being clear. But clarity isn't cruelty, it's respect, for myself, for the situation, for the truth. As I reread the document, I felt the quiet shift inside me again. Not triumph, not rebellion, just alignment. A life shouldn't need to be negotiated around someone else's unpredictability. Structure doesn't imprison, it protects. And as I reviewed the terms, I realized I was building the kind of safety I'd never been offered. The edge of the binder brushed my knuckles as I closed it, the faint snap of the clasp echoing in the stillness of the room. A thin draft slipped through the window, stirring the corner of the page before settling back down. The scent of warm paper, fresh ink, and heated toner rose through the air. I traced the seam of the binder with my thumb, feeling the textured ridges beneath the plastic. Across the table, the cup of water reflected the muted glow of the overcast afternoon, its surface trembling slightly as the heater clicked on. Ordinary details, small and grounding. They reminded me that this wasn't a dramatic turning point. It was simply the next step in a process I'd put in motion with quiet intention. And somehow those details made the boundary I'd drawn feel even more real. The confirmation email arrived just after dusk, its subject line plain enough to miss if I hadn't been watching for it. I opened it immediately, scanning for the signature, the date, the formal acceptance of the terms I'd sent. Each line aligned cleanly, without hedging or vagueness, just a straightforward acknowledgement that the settlement would be honored upon receipt of funds. I exhaled once, slow and controlled, then moved into action. I transferred the payment from the new account, the numbers blinking briefly on the screen before settling into their final place. The transaction processed in quiet increments, no fanfare, no alarms, just a clean shift from one ledger to another. I took screenshots of every step: the transfer page, the confirmation number, the posted timestamp. They lined up in a straight column on my desktop, a digital trail of a decision carried out with precision. When I closed the banking app, the room felt almost too still, as though the act of settling the debt had paused the air around me. But stillness was good. Stillness meant completion. I organized the documents into a folder labeled Evidence 2042, dragging each screenshot, email, and uploaded receipt into its place. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching the files stack neatly, forming the backbone of a timeline no one could dispute. I renamed each document so nothing was vague. Transfer completed. Settlement accepted. Proof of payment. The cursor blinked in the corner of the screen, an unspoken invitation to second-guess something. I didn't. I simply reviewed once more, confirming each date and detail. When the folder snapped closed, I felt a small lift in my chest, the kind that comes from creating order in a place that once felt unmanageable. The house around me carried that late evening hush, appliances winding down, pipes settling, the faint hum of the heater rising through the vents. I stepped back from the desk, letting the neatness of the digital record imprint itself into the moment. There would be no room for reinterpretation. Not this time. Received. Clearing in 48 hours, I read softly. The sentence, simple as it was, carried the unmistakable tone of finality. There was no warmth in it, no friendliness, but no loopholes either. It was the kind of clarity I'd been craving for years. Neutral, direct, undeniable. I repeated it under my breath once more, letting the words settle into my understanding. This wasn't the kind of reassurance built on emotion or trust. It was the kind built on systems, on processes that don't bend to family dynamics or holiday laughter. The statement didn't need embellishment. It didn't need interpretation. It was enough. Inside, something unlatched. Not dramatically, not with relief, but with the quiet click of a door that had always been there yet never fully opened. I felt lighter, without feeling joyous, steadier without feeling victorious. It wasn't triumph, it was release. For years, my financial life had felt like a corridor with too many doors locked from the outside. Tonight, one opened from within, and the simplicity of it startled me. No pleading, no explanations, just following a system designed to respond to order and documentation, rather than personality or pressure. I stood for a moment, letting that truth settle. My chest rose evenly, not tight, not braced. Something in my posture shifted into place. Shoulders level, breath even. This wasn't the end of anything. It was just the part where the ground stops tilting. The smell of dry ink lingered from the papers I'd printed earlier, mixing with the faint metallic scent that drifted through the slightly cracked window. A soft breeze nudged the corner of the settlement agreement, lifting it just enough to make a tiny sound against the desk before it settled again. I reached out and anchored the page with my fingertips. The surface beneath it felt warm from the lamp, smooth and steady in a way that contrasted with the cool air brushing my wrist. My laptop dimmed automatically, the screen fading into a muted reflection of the room behind me. The glow of the desk light pooled across the documents, casting long shadows that stretched toward the floor like thin, deliberate lines. These small physical details grounded the moment: ink drying, paper shifting, light warming. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet texture of a step completed. A step I'd taken alone, deliberately, and without hesitation. The dining room was already warm when I walked in, the kind of warmth that comes from too many bodies squeezed around a table meant for smaller gatherings. Plates clattered, chairs scraped, and someone passed a bowl of roasted vegetables before I'd even found my seat. My parents were in unusually high spirits, their laughter threading through the room in practiced loops that never quite reached their eyes. It didn't take long before the familiar tease resurfaced. The debt, said lightly, tossed into the air like confetti meant to make everyone laugh. A cousin raised his eyebrows, amused. Someone else clucked their tongue, playfully dramatic. The whole thing swelled into a small wave of humor that washed right over me. I smiled, not wide enough to invite more, just enough to blend in. My fingers tightened around the edge of my napkin, the fabric soft but steady beneath my touch. I didn't correct them. I didn't hint that something had changed. My truth wasn't meant for this table, not yet. Their laughter moved on without me, leaving a faint echo in its wake. Sometimes silence is the only way to keep your footing. I lifted my spoon, noticing a slight tremor in my hand. Nothing visible unless someone stared, but I felt it, like a small fault line under the surface. I pressed the silverware against the edge of my plate to steady myself, letting the cool metal ground me. My parents didn't notice. They were too busy continuing the bit, nudging each other every time the word "oh" or "help" slipped into the conversation. The tremor wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was the tension of holding a truth they hadn't earned access to. A truth I wasn't ready to lay in the center of their table like a centerpiece. They didn't know the debt was already dissolving, that the numbers they joked about were fading into irrelevance with every passing hour. I glanced around at the faces, familiar, animated, oblivious. For a moment, I wondered what it would feel like to correct them just once, to say, actually, that chapter is over. But I didn't. Not tonight. Not like this. I steadied my breath instead, letting the moment pass over me like a cold breeze slipping through a cracked window. "Yeah, I can manage," I said, the words light and almost airy. They sounded easy enough, casual enough to blend into the noise of utensils and overlapping chatter. But inside them, beneath the tone, lived a different meaning altogether, one they couldn't hear. I wasn't agreeing with their joke. I wasn't conceding to the old narrative. I was acknowledging something only I knew, that the ground had shifted while they weren't looking. No one paused or reacted. The phrase drifted into the current of conversation and disappeared, swallowed by the noise. But for me, it landed with the faintest thud, a small anchor of truth held softly in place. Sometimes the simplest sentences carry entire decisions inside them. A sense of loneliness pressed against my ribs, gentle but insistent. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that aches. More like the quiet awareness that comes from being in a room full of people, yet feeling like you're watching from behind a pane of glass. Their jokes weren't malicious. They were habitual. An old family rhythm they didn't realize I no longer danced to. But habit can bruise just as deeply as intention, and hearing them repeat stories that painted me as unsteady, unreliable, the one always needing help, stirred something old inside me, a small ache, a small resistance. I kept breathing through it, reminding myself that tonight wasn't about correcting anything. It was about observing, about allowing the truth I carried to strengthen in silence rather than be diluted by the noise. Even so, that quiet pang reminded me of the years I'd spent bending to fit their version of me. But not anymore. The spoon slipped from my fingers and tapped against the plate, a clean, hollow sound that cut through my thoughts. Not loud, but distinct enough for me to notice how empty it rang compared to the chatter around me. I picked it up again, feeling the slight warmth left behind by the food. A faint draft brushed my ankle, traveling from the hallway, pulling at the hem of my pants. Someone laughed across the table, a little too loudly. Someone else reached for the bread, their arm brushing mine for a second before withdrawing. The room was tight with movement, sound, and overlapping stories. Yet the space inside my chest felt strangely open, almost untouched by everything happening around me. I pressed my palm lightly against my thigh, grounding myself in that small, quiet calm. The emptiness wasn't frightening. It was clarity. I cleared my desk that night, pushing aside the clutter until only 2 pieces of paper remained in front of me: the photo of the check and the printed confirmation of the debt's dismissal. I placed them side by side, aligning their corners as if I were arranging evidence before a small, private tribunal. The room was dim except for the desk lamp, its narrow beam creating a circle of light that held both documents like they were 2 witnesses summoned to speak. For a long moment, I didn't touch either one. I just looked. The check, creased, softened at the edges, carried the unmistakable trace of my grandfather's handwriting. The dismissal letter, sharp and official, carried the weight of something that couldn't be undone or brushed away with a laugh. Together they formed a quiet symmetry, intention and outcome, gift and correction. The beginning and the clean line drawn after it. I straightened in my chair, letting the silence settle fully around me. This wasn't proof for anyone else. It was clarity for me. And clarity has a way of realigning an entire story without making a sound. I clipped the papers together with a small metal binder clip, a soft, decisive snap that echoed faintly in the stillness. It sounded almost ceremonial, the way certain gestures become meaningful, not because of what they symbolize, but because of the deliberate calm with which they're done. The clip held the 2 pages neatly, binding them into a single narrative the way no conversation at a dinner table ever could. I slid my fingers along the edges, feeling the difference between them, the textured softness of the check's worn paper, the smooth, firm surface of the printed letter. They made sense together now in a way they hadn't before. The check was no longer an uncertain offering or a punchline waiting to be dismissed. And the dismissal letter, neutral, official, turned the entire situation into something clean and irrefutable. I sat back and breathed evenly, letting the realization take shape without rushing it. Sometimes meaning isn't found in the moment something is given, but in what comes after. "Everything's in order for an audit," I muttered, testing the truth of the words as they left my mouth. They hung there quietly, not dramatic or triumphant, just accurate. The documents didn't need interpretation. They didn't need anyone else's blessing. They simply existed, steady and aligned, ready to stand up to scrutiny from any angle. Saying it out loud made the moment feel grounded, as though I'd clicked a puzzle piece into place. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation or a performance. I was preparing for clarity. And clarity doesn't shout, it just stands. A thought nudged its way into my awareness. Transparency can be gentle. It doesn't have to cut or accuse. It can simply illuminate, offering light without heat. For so long, I had associated financial conversations with tension, expectation, subtle pressure. But here, in this quiet room, with these 2 ordinary sheets of paper, everything felt surprisingly merciful. There was no conflict in these documents, no hidden barbs. They were straightforward, emotionless, factual. And in that simplicity, I felt an unexpected softness bloom in my chest. Not toward anyone else, but toward myself. It struck me that clarity isn't only protection, it can also be kindness. A way of saying, this is the truth, and the truth is steady. My posture softened, the tightness easing between my shoulders. I breathed in fully for the first time that evening. Truth, when held calmly, can feel like warmth. The desk lamp shifted slightly as the bulb adjusted, its glow brightening for a brief second before settling into a deeper, more focused light. Shadows sharpened along the edges of the papers, tracing thin lines across the wooden surface like quiet undercurrents. I watched the way the light intensified, how it carved out a sharper outline around the documents, how it made the ink stand out with newfound precision. The lamp hummed softly, its warmth brushing against my forearm as I leaned closer. The air in the room felt steady, cool at the edges but warm where the lamp's glow touched. The grain of the wooden desk caught the light in subtle ridges, grounding the moment with its ordinary texture. Nothing dramatic moved, nothing shifted loudly. But the lighting changed just enough to make the papers appear more solid, more real, as if they'd stepped into clearer focus. Sometimes a small change in brightness reveals more than a conversation ever could. That night, after the house settled into its familiar hush, I opened a blank email and let the white screen fill the room with its muted glow. I typed slowly at first, choosing each word the way you select stones for a path, measured, intentional, meant to hold weight without adding sharpness. The subject line stayed plain, uncharged, offering no hint of tension. I attached the documents with steady hands, watching the progress bar crawl forward in a calm, unhurried line. I wrote the message in the same tone I wished the entire family lived in, factual, neutral, direct. I stated that we needed a conversation. I listed the date and time. I kept my sentences short, clean, impossible to misread or bend. When I reached the end, I paused, reread everything twice, then added one final note letting them know the attachments were for review ahead of the meeting. I didn't justify anything. I didn't explain myself. I didn't soften the structure. I simply sent clarity into the room, quiet but undeniable. The cursor blinked for a moment after I hit send, as if acknowledging the shift. Before closing the laptop, I scrolled to the bottom of the message and reread the final section. 3 straightforward boundaries listed in calm, unembellished lines. No accusations, no hidden meanings. Just the truth arranged in bold type so no one could later say they misunderstood. These weren't demands. They were conditions for respect. I stared at the bold text, the way the letters seemed sharper than the rest of the email, as if the weight of intention had thickened the font. For years, my family had relied on blurred edges, jokes, half-truths, selective memory. Ambiguity had been their most effective tool. But there was nothing ambiguous here, nothing left to interpretation. It felt strange to see the boundaries written out so plainly, like watching a door unlock that had been stuck for so long I'd forgotten what it looked like on the other side. I sat back, feeling the space around me widen. Not a victory, not defiance. Just a gentle reclaiming of room. Some truths become sturdier when they're written down. Friday evening works, I said softly to the empty room. Hearing it aloud gave the plan a sense of solidity. I wasn't speaking to anyone, yet the simple phrase settled into the air with quiet weight. The neutrality of it felt right. No emotion, no expectation. Just acknowledgement of a time that would soon carry more meaning than the words suggested. I tapped the laptop lid lightly before closing it. The sound sharp but clean. The room returned to its dim stillness, the kind that falls over a space once an important task is done. I let the silence answer back. I wasn't hoping for understanding. Hope wasn't a tool I trusted anymore, not in these situations. What I needed was clarity, lines drawn so cleanly that even if someone ignored them, they couldn't pretend they hadn't seen them. As I replayed the email in my mind, I felt a steadiness fill the space where worry usually settled. This wasn't about convincing anyone. It wasn't about pleading for better treatment or asking them to see me differently. It was about presenting truth in a way that stood on its own, untangled from emotion. If they didn't understand, that was fine. Understanding was optional. Respect was not. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the difference down to the breath in my lungs. This wasn't confrontation. It was structure. The wall clock ticked above me, steady and unhurried. Each second a small reminder that I had time. Time to breathe. Time to move intentionally. Time to let the coming conversation arrive without dread. The glow from the street lamp outside pushed a soft rectangle of light across the floor, brushing against the leg of my chair. I felt the cool air draft under the door, the faint vibration of the refrigerator kicking on, the gentle hum of the heater as it pushed warmth into the corners of the room. All these small sounds stitched together a quiet backdrop against which my thoughts settled. My thumb brushed the edge of the table, sensing the grain of the wood beneath the varnish. Ordinary details grounding me. This wasn't a moment of anxiety. It was preparation. The email was sent, the documents were in place, and now the rest would move as it needed to. I inhaled slowly, letting the room's quiet hold me steady. Everything was aligned. Friday evening arrived with the kind of muted tension that settles into corners before anyone enters a room. I set the printed timeline on the table. Check. Verification. Purchase. Clearance. Each page placed deliberately, edges aligned like steps carved into stone. When my parents walked in, I didn't speak right away. I simply handed them the stack and let the sound of paper shifting fill the space between us. They sat across from me, the overhead light catching the edges of the documents as they flipped through them. The room went unusually still. No chatter, no nervous jokes, no familiar quips designed to dissolve seriousness. Just quiet reading. I kept my hands folded, my breath steady. When they reached the page showing the settlement confirmation, something in the room tightened. Not confrontational, not explosive. Just the subtle recoil that happens when reality lands heavier than expected. I asked them to read everything before speaking. My voice was even, unhurried. A full minute passed, long enough for every page to make its own impression. And then the silence shifted from confusion into recognition. I slid a fresh set of printed copies across the table, one for each of them. That small movement filled the room with the soft rustle of paper, a sound that felt louder than any words we'd exchanged so far. I asked them to take another moment and read quietly, giving the space permission to hold whatever surfaced. The quiet lasted longer this time. I watched their eyes move line by line, pausing at the timestamps, the signatures, the transfer receipts. My mother's brow tightened. My father's jaw shifted once, then stilled. The usual defenses, the practiced humor, the airy dismissals had no foothold in ink and dates. For the first time in years, they weren't reacting to me. They were reacting to facts. And facts don't bend to tone or memory or intention. The stillness in the room deepened. It didn't feel heavy, it felt exact, as if each second was marking its place with deliberate clarity. I waited without filling the silence. Some conversations begin long before the first word is spoken. "These are the documents," I said quietly. Just 4 words. No edge, no challenge. They didn't need elaboration. The pages in front of them did all the speaking required. My voice sounded almost soft in comparison to the crisp truth laid out on the table. I didn't explain the process or the logic behind each step. I didn't narrate the timeline or justify my decisions. I didn't need to. Everything was written, verifiable, dated, complete. My parents looked up, eyes shifting between me and the papers. Their expressions were careful in a way I hadn't seen before, as if they were adjusting to a light they hadn't realized had been switched on. I sat still, letting the simple sentence settle between us. Sometimes the clearest statement is the one that leaves nothing else to interpret. Standing there, I noticed an unexpected calm settling into my body, like a weight sliding off my shoulders without fanfare. The fear that used to rise in moments like this simply didn't appear. I wasn't defending anything. I wasn't trying to be understood. I was presenting what was true. The shift in power wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, almost tender. A quiet reclaiming of my own footing. I straightened a page that had curled slightly at the corner. and felt the steadiness return to my fingertips. Across the table, my parents exchanged a look, smaller than their usual silent conversations, but sharper, more revealing. It was the look of people realizing they were no longer the sole narrators of a story. For years, I'd let the noise shape my responses. Tonight, all the noise had been replaced by paper. And paper doesn't bluff. I breathed in slowly, letting the moment open without rushing it. Truth doesn't need defense, it just needs space. A thin steam rose from the cup of tea beside me, drifting upward in a fragile ribbon. The warmth brushed my face as I leaned back, allowing the subtle heat to settle around my jaw. I felt the ceramic edge with my fingertips, smooth, faintly warm, grounding. My parents continued reading, the soft shifting of pages like small breaths between bigger thoughts. The tea's aroma, faintly floral, almost citrus, mixed with the dry scent of printer ink, giving the moment an oddly calm domesticity. The light above us cast a muted glow over the table, softening the contrast of shadows on the papers. I watched the steam fade, thinning into the air before disappearing completely. No raised voices, no interruptions, no dramatics. Just 3 people in a room, sitting with the truth. Sometimes stillness is the most honest temperature a room can hold. It didn't take long for the first reaction to break the silence. My mother's voice came soft but strained, like a thread pulled too tight. "This feels dramatic," she said, eyes flicking over the papers as if searching for a version of the story she already knew. My father's tone followed, sharper, but wrapped in a familiar veneer. "You're blowing things out of proportion, making it look worse than it was." I didn't interrupt. I didn't match their tone. I simply tapped one finger near the printed confirmation, the timestamp, the signature. The facts stayed still even as their words tried to rewrite the air between us. They cycled through the usual reasons, misunderstandings, intentions, jokes taken too seriously. But each explanation slid off the page without sticking. The room felt like it was holding 2 realities at once. The one they were trying to restore, and the one they couldn't unsee anymore. I didn't push them toward either one. I just waited, letting truth do its quiet work. The shift happened slowly, like something emerging from fog. My mother's defensiveness softened into something more fragile. Fear, maybe. She pressed her lips together, eyes lowering to the documents again. "We just didn't want things to fall apart," she murmured. "You know how money complicates everything." My father's response revealed more than he meant it to. "People talk," he said, almost under his breath. "Family should look stable." There it was. Not the joke, not the teasing, not the performance. The fear behind it. His fear of judgment, her fear of scarcity returning. The 2 forces that had shaped so much of our family's behavior without ever being named. Their attempts to control the narrative weren't about me. They were about protecting illusions they'd held for years. I leaned back, letting the realization settle. These weren't villains. They were people afraid of losing the armor they had mistaken for love. Understanding that didn't change the facts, but it softened the edges around them. "There aren't any excuses left," I said quietly. The words weren't sharp, they weren't meant to cut, they simply named the moment. My tone remained even, light enough not to escalate anything, firm enough not to be mistaken for uncertainty. Their eyes moved to mine, not confrontational but unsettled. Not because I'd accused them of anything, but because the paper in front of them left no room for pretend. It was strange how a simple sentence could feel heavier than raised voices. Quiet truth often does. I didn't add more. I didn't explain what I meant or soften the statement with reassurance. Sometimes clarity is its own complete sentence. A strange calm rooted itself in my chest, deep, steady, unshaken. Not triumph, not vindication. Just the quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Their influence no longer bent the air around me. Their assumptions no longer guided the narrative. Every excuse they reached for felt smaller now, shrinking under the weight of documentation they couldn't argue with. I watched the moment they realized it too. A flicker in their posture, a pause in their breathing. A subtle recognition that the old dynamic was slipping out of their hands. Not because I wrestled it away, because I'd stopped agreeing to hold it. It was surprising how gentle power could feel when you weren't using it to overpower anyone, just to stand steadily on your own ground. The tension in my shoulders eased, replaced with something like quiet, deliberate presence. The air in the room thickened slightly, the way it does before a rainstorm, even indoors. My mother's fingers traced the edge of one page, her touch slow, almost hesitant. The sound of paper shifting was soft, but it punctured the silence in a way words couldn't. A faint gust from the hallway brushed my arm, carrying with it the cool scent of winter air. My tea had gone lukewarm, the steam gone, leaving only a thin ring of warmth along the ceramic rim. I wrapped my hands around it anyway, letting the residual heat anchor me. The shadows on the table stretched as the overhead light dimmed slightly, the bulb settling into its evening hum. The documents remained clear, crisp, unmoving. All the movement in the room came from them, not from me, not from the papers, but from the shifting ground beneath their understanding. Small physical details revealed what words didn't need to. I unfolded the sheet I'd prepared, 3 short lines arranged with the simplicity of a shopping list, though each one carried more weight than any number printed on the table. I placed it between us, smoothing the page with my palm. My voice stayed steady as I read them aloud. No references to debt, no insults disguised as humor, no interference in my finances. Each point landed gently, not as a threat, but as a structure. Clean, unembellished, unambiguous. I paused after each line, letting the silence settle around it like dust finding its natural place. I didn't ask for agreement, I didn't wait for approval. I simply stated what I would and would not participate in moving forward. My mother blinked as if trying to adjust to a new kind of lighting. My father leaned back slightly, the document resting before him like something he wasn't sure how to pick up without changing its shape. I took another breath, slow and easy. Boundaries don't raise walls. They draw maps. And this was mine. I explained, in the same tone someone might use to describe instructions on a manual, that each boundary had a consequence built in. Not punitive, just structural. A cooling period of 72 hours if things slipped into disrespect. A longer pause if old patterns resurfaced. Not forever. Not dramatic. Just enough space for respect to find its footing again. I kept my words measured, pausing when I felt myself wanting to soften them. Softening had never protected me. Clarity had. I watched their eyes move across the page, reading each line with the slow concentration of people encountering something unfamiliar, yet undeniably simple. My mother's hand hovered near the paper but didn't touch it. My father's jaw tightened and released, the faintest tell of a man who had never had to meet a boundary he didn't create himself. But this wasn't about controlling them. It wasn't even about changing them. It was about naming the conditions under which I could remain. And the room understood that before either of them spoke. "This is what I won't do," I said quietly. The sentence floated into the space with the precision of a pin dropped on still water. It didn't echo, didn't strain. It simply existed, clear, unobtrusive, and complete. I didn't elaborate. I didn't list justifications or offer reassurance. The boundaries were written. The consequences were written. My voice only needed to confirm the line I had already drawn. My parents looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. Not anger, not confusion, not quite hurt. More like recognition. A slow, dawning understanding that I had stepped into a version of myself they hadn't anticipated. I sat still, letting the words rest exactly where they landed. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is what you refuse to carry anymore. I felt something soften inside me, not toward them, but toward myself. All those years of bending, adjusting, cushioning their discomfort had taught me to shrink my needs until they fit into the smallest spaces. But tonight, with the paper between us and the truth laid out in simple lines, I felt a quiet release. Choosing peace over winning didn't make me weak. It made me precise. Their reactions wavered between resistance and contemplation, like two people trying to decide whether the ground had actually shifted or if they were imagining it. I didn't lean forward. I didn't pull back. I simply stayed where I was, steady in my own posture. This wasn't an argument. It wasn't even a negotiation. It was me choosing a life where dignity didn't need to be defended at every turn. And that choice settled into my bones with a weightless clarity. The steam from the tea had thinned into faint wisps, disappearing faster than before. I lifted the cup and felt only a trace of warmth left along the rim. The porcelain was cooling, settling, much like the air around us. My mother's fingers tapped once against the edge of the document, a small, uncertain motion. My father exhaled through his nose, steady but resigned, as if recalibrating something internal. A faint hum from the heater drifted across the room, barely noticeable but consistent. The paper remained still on the table, its white surface catching a soft sheen from the overhead light. I traced the rim of my cup with my thumb, feeling the subtle ridge where glaze met air. Every physical detail around me felt strangely aligned. The cooling tea, the quiet hum, the crisp edges of the paper. It was the kind of stillness that follows truth, not conflict. And in that stillness, nothing felt fragile. It felt exact. I reached for the pen beside me, the same one I'd used to sign the settlement documents, and uncapped it with a quiet click. The sound felt strangely significant in the still room. I lowered the tip to the bottom of the boundary sheet and signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes. My handwriting moved in a clean line across the page, firm and steady, the kind of signature that didn't tremble or pause to check if anyone approved. The ink glided smoothly, the paper offering just enough resistance to keep the line honest. When I lifted the pen, I saw the curve of my name settling into place. Nothing ornate, nothing decorative, just clear. A signature doesn't ask for agreement. It simply marks where one person stands. Across from me, my parents watched with a mixture of caution and unfamiliar respect, like they were witnessing something they weren't entirely prepared for. I slid the page toward them without a word. Signing wasn't a threat. It was a decision. The faintest sound rose from the paper, just a soft rasp as the ink dried. A subtle friction, like a whisper brushing against fabric. It was barely noticeable, yet it landed with the same clarity as a spoken reminder. This boundary was no longer an idea. It existed now, ink embedded in the fibers. A thin line of blue settled into a deeper shade as it absorbed fully. I caught the moment the color darkened, finalizing itself. The quiet shift felt almost like a heartbeat, small, contained, but unmistakably alive. My parents' eyes followed the movement of my hand as I capped the pen and set it aside. No one spoke. The silence wasn't tense. It was contemplative. The kind that forms when something undeniable enters the room, and everyone feels the need to adjust around it. The sound of the pen being placed on the table,
A soft tap, echoed with a subtle certainty. This wasn't anger. This wasn't distance. It was clarity, written down. Respect this, or we stop here, I said, calm, even.
Steady. The sentence felt like it had been waiting inside me for years, not as a threat, but as a simple truth I had finally learned how to voice. I didn't raise my tone. I didn't repeat myself. I didn't fill the silence with explanations or soften the edges with apologies. It was a boundary stated, not negotiated. Their eyes flickered, absorbing the weight of the words. My mother opened her mouth slightly, then closed it again, as if realizing anything she said would only echo the old rhythm we were leaving behind. My father sat back, arms crossed loosely, gaze lowered to the page. Neither of them pushed back. Neither of them argued. The words settled into the space like a steady hand pressed gently against a swinging door. Quiet, firm, stopping it in its tracks. Sometimes the simplest statements hold the entire structure upright. I realized with a kind of quiet surprise that my hands had stopped trembling. For so long these conversations had left me bracing, shoulders tight, breath shallow, muscles ready for the sting of dismissal or the weight of blame. But now, sitting in front of the document I'd signed, I felt none of that. My chest wasn't tight. My jaw wasn't clenched. My breath moved evenly, unbothered. I felt present in a way I hadn't felt in their presence for years. Power didn't flood me. It didn't surge. It simply arrived. Quiet. Grounded, unmistakably mine. My parents shifted, adjusting to the new temperature in the room. I didn't mirror their tension. I didn't try to soothe it away. I just sat there, steady, letting the balance settle where it naturally would. Strength doesn't always feel like force. Sometimes it feels like not shrinking. The chair scraped softly against the floor as I shifted, just an inch, just enough to settle more comfortably. The sound was dry, small, but it cut through the quiet like a marker placed on a map. I rested my palms on the table, feeling the faint coolness of the wood seep into my skin. The air had changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably, like the pause after a deep inhale, when the world waits for the next breath to be chosen, not reflexive. My mother's fingers curled around the edge of the table. My father tapped once against his knee before going still again. The house hummed around us. The distant rumble of the heater, the faint shift of pipes cooling, the low murmur of wind brushing the windows. Everyday sounds, yet they felt sharper, clearer, as if the boundary on the table had tuned the room into a different frequency. Nothing in the space felt fragile anymore. It felt deliberate. My mother was the first to break the stillness. She leaned forward slightly, her voice softened into something almost pleading. "This isn't you," she said, as if I'd been temporarily possessed by someone less agreeable, less malleable. Someone must be influencing you, filling your head. The old attempt to shift responsibility away from the behavior itself and onto some imagined outside source settled over the room like a thin fog. My father added his own tactic, calmer but edged with worry. "You know how people talk, you making things official. It doesn't look good for the family." I listened without interrupting. Their words didn't surprise me. I had predicted this exact angle, the mixture of guilt, image, and denial that always surfaced when they felt control slipping. I watched them try to wrap their discomfort in concern, expecting me to smooth it over like I always had. But the person they were appealing to, the version of me who absorbed everything quietly, wasn't sitting at the table anymore. I reached for my notes, steady, deliberate. The discussion wasn't emotional, it was procedural. I clicked the audio recorder open on my phone, the small gesture shifting the energy in the room, like a tiny change in altitude. My parents paused, thrown off by the lack of apology or hesitation. I read the terms again, just the facts, no tone added. My voice carrying the cadence of someone reading from a contract rather than engaging in a family dispute. 3 boundaries, 3 consequences. Effective immediately. Their reactions flickered across their faces. Confusion first, then frustration. Then something quieter, like resignation brushing the surface before settling out of sight. My father attempted one last pivot, trying to frame it as an overreaction. My mother tried to reframe it as hurt feelings. Neither framing landed. I didn't offer my side. I didn't justify anything. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was creating clarity. And clarity doesn't need volume. It just needs repetition. When I finished reading, the room felt different. Not hostile, not tense. Just level. The kind of level that comes from rules finally being spoken instead of implied. Respect it, or we stop here, I repeated softly. The words carried no anger. They didn't need it. They stood on their own, clean and self-contained. My voice was the closest thing to a flat line, calm, unshaken, neither coaxing nor challenging. It was almost startling how steady it came out, after years of swallowing my needs before they ever reached the surface. My mother blinked rapidly, as if unsure where to place the hurt she'd prepared. My father's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't say anything. They weren't ready to push back, not with the documents lying between us, not with my voice refusing to shift into the familiar softness they relied on. The sentence didn't rise above the air. It settled into it. And that was enough. I didn't look away from them. I didn't fill the silence. There are moments when a single line replaces an entire history of explanations. This was one of them. Inside, I felt a clarity I didn't recognize at first. Not adrenaline, not anger, not fear. Something quieter, something rooted. The kind of clarity that doesn't ask for reassurance because it doesn't need validation to stay upright. My breath moved in an even rhythm, each inhale and exhale exactly where it belonged. For so long, conversations like this had felt like walking across thin ice, terrified of the wrong word, the wrong tone, the wrong glance. But tonight, the ice wasn't beneath me. It was beneath them. They were the ones adjusting to the new surface, testing the strength of ground that had always been mine, but never acknowledged. I watched my mother clasp her hands together, the gesture small and uncertain. My father rubbed his palm once along his knee, the closest he came to revealing discomfort. Their reactions no longer dictated mine. I remained still. Sometimes power is simply the absence of retreat. The heater clicked off, leaving the room with a dry, quiet stillness. I heard the faint hum of the refrigerator and the muted rush of a car passing outside. Everyday sounds, but they felt sharper in the absence of raised voices. My chair creaked slightly as I shifted my posture, planting my feet more firmly on the floor. A light draft brushed the back of my arm where my sleeve had pulled up, the cool air tracing a thin line along my skin. I folded my hands loosely in front of me, grounding myself in the moment's simplicity. There was no chaos to navigate, no emotional storm to brace against, just the calm presence of truth sitting between us in physical form. My parents' eyes drifted to the boundary sheet again. The paper didn't move, it didn't bend. It held its place with more stability than any conversation we'd ever had about respect. That steadiness filled the space, and me. The next morning, the meeting still echoing faintly in my chest, I pulled out my phone and called the landlord of a small studio I'd toured weeks earlier. It wasn't much, just a single room with tall windows and quiet floors. But it had felt like air. When he picked up, I asked if the unit was still available. He confirmed it was. I asked to place a deposit. My voice didn't tremble. I opened my banking app and transferred the amount without hesitation. 2 cardboard boxes sat near my front door, left over from a move I never fully unpacked. And I slid them into the center of the living room. One for essentials, one for documents. The simplicity steadied me. As I lined the bottom of the first box with folded towels, I realized I wasn't running. I wasn't escaping in urgency or fear. I was preparing for the kind of freedom that requires logistics, the kind built one choice at a time. I taped the edges of the box lightly, the sound clean and decisive. Sometimes the most powerful exits begin with quiet organization. I sorted through my drawers with a deliberate rhythm: pull, assess, place. A small stack of clothes folded neatly into the corner. A few books I couldn't imagine leaving behind. A single framed photo that still felt like mine. Everything else could wait. Then I turned to the desk. I slid each document into envelopes labeled with crisp, black ink. ID, banking, agreements, medical, employment. The final envelope, thicker than the others, held the entire timeline of the debt. Every receipt, every confirmation, every email. I placed it flat in the second box, smoothing the top as if sealing the past into a shape I could finally carry without strain. I drafted a brief email to the movers, just a simple request for availability over the weekend. No apologies for the short notice. No explanation. My fingers moved with a steadiness that surprised even me. Maybe freedom wasn't loud. Maybe it was administrative. I clicked send, the cursor blinking back at me as if acknowledging the shift. "I'll be moving this weekend," I said aloud as I updated my calendar. The words didn't feel rushed or dramatic. They sounded right, exact. Hearing them made the decision feel fully real, as though speaking it anchored it into the world with a small but meaningful weight. I didn't say it for anyone else's benefit, only to match the sound with the truth already settled inside me. I marked the date, blocked off the time, added a simple note: studio keys. Nothing more. The simplicity felt clean, almost elegant in its lack of clutter. As I closed my planner, a quiet steadiness settled into my hands. I hadn't sought anyone's blessing, hadn't asked for approval, hadn't waited for circumstances to shift before stepping forward. The decision belonged to me, fully. And saying it out loud felt like stepping into a hallway where every door was finally unlocked. For the first time in a long while, the path ahead didn't feel tangled. It didn't branch unpredictably or demand negotiation. It stretched out in a straight line, narrow but certain. I could see each step clearly. Pack tonight, move on Saturday, begin a new routine on Monday. It felt less like a dramatic break and more like a quiet correction, a return to something that had always been waiting for me. A lightness worked its way into my breathing. Not excitement, not relief, just the release that follows a decision made without hesitation. I felt grounded, centered in a way that had nothing to do with rebellion and everything to do with belonging to myself. My parents' reactions, their storm of confusion and resistance, drifted to the edges of my mind like distant weather. Whether they understood or not didn't change the direction of my steps. Some choices aren't about leaving people behind. They're about finally stepping into your own outline. The scent of packing tape filled the room as I sealed the first box, its adhesive pulling away from the roll with a dry, steady rip. The sound echoed faintly through the quiet apartment. A cool draft slipped beneath the door, brushing the back of my calves, and reminding me of the open space outside these walls. I pressed the tape flat, smoothing the wrinkles with my palm. The cardboard felt firm beneath my hands, its texture rough but reassuring. A pair of shoes thudded gently against the side of the box as I placed them inside, the muffled sound grounding me in the physicality of the moment. The second box waited open beside the table, the envelopes of documents stacked neatly inside like a spine holding the shape of my next chapter. Light from the window fell across the floor in a thin, clear stripe, stretching toward the boxes as if marking their significance. Everything felt deliberate, composed, measured. The room didn't feel empty. It felt ready. The next afternoon, I drove to my grandfather's house, taking the familiar turns almost without thinking. The winter sun hung low, casting soft gold across the lawn where the frost hadn't fully melted. His house always carried the warmth of lived-in time. Nothing rushed, nothing out of place. When he opened the door, leaning slightly on the frame, his eyes lit with that steady kindness he gave freely but never carelessly. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of cedar and the wool blankets he kept draped over the sofa. I sat beside him, pulling the folder from my bag. I didn't give him the whole story, just the truth he deserved. I told him briefly what I'd done with the check, how it had helped me settle something permanently. He listened without interruption, nodding as if he'd known this outcome long before I did. I placed the confirmation letter on his lap. His hands, worn but steady, rested on the edges as he read. The room felt still in a way that didn't hold tension, just clarity shared between two people. He studied the letter for a long moment, the way he always read things that mattered, not skimming, not pretending to understand faster than he did. When he finally looked up, his voice carried the same gentle firmness as his handwriting. "Money only does good when it keeps your spine straight," he said. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't meant to sound wise. They simply came from a life that had taught him the value of standing, without bending to someone else's version of you. I felt the truth of it settle in my chest like a soft anchor. Growing up, he had been the only one who offered help without strings, without implication, without reshaping the story afterward. And now, seeing him read the confirmation, I understood why the check had steadied me more than the jokes had shaken me. He tapped the page gently, his thumb tracing the printed line where the debt was officially dismissed. "You used it right," he said. Just 4 words, but they felt like approval from someone whose judgment carried its own quiet weight. "Thank you," I said, the words soft but steady. They weren't gratitude for the money. They were gratitude for him, for the trust he'd placed in me long before I ever learned to trust myself. He nodded, not brushing it off, not minimizing it, simply acknowledging it in a way that made it feel earned. I placed the folder back in my bag, but the moment remained open between us. There was no need to explain every detail. He didn't ask why the rest of the family didn't know yet. He didn't question my choices or second-guess my process. He just accepted the truth as it was, without decoration or doubt. The quiet between us felt different from the silence at the dinner table. Lighter, grounded, like air that had room to move. Sometimes the right listener changes the whole shape of a story. As we sat there, a sense of alignment settled through me, full, calm, exact. Talking to him didn't require bracing myself. There was no undercurrent I had to interpret, no performance I needed to sidestep. The truth could sit openly between us without shrinking, without needing to defend its edges. For years, I'd shaped myself around other people's comfort, waiting to be given permission to trust my own decisions. But here, beside him, I felt something more solid. a validation rooted in understanding rather than approval. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't praise me. He simply recognized what I'd done, as if it were the most natural step I could have taken. And somehow, that quiet recognition carried more weight than any applause. I breathed in deeply, the air warm and familiar. The decision I'd made felt less like a break and more like a continuation of something he'd always encouraged inside me. The path ahead didn't look lonely. It looked intentional. A thin strip of late afternoon light slid across the blanket on his lap, catching on the textured weave. The room was warm, almost drowsy, the radiator humming softly beneath the window. A breeze outside nudged the branches against the siding, creating a gentle tapping that blended into the quiet melody of the house. He shifted slightly, pulling the blanket up around his knees, and I could hear the faint rustle of the wool brushing against itself. The air smelled faintly of the herbal tea he'd made earlier, its warmth still lingering in the corner of the room. I rested my fingertips on the arm of the chair, feeling the smooth, worn wood beneath the varnish. Every detail around us felt grounded, settled, sure. Nothing rushed, nothing strained. It was the kind of calm that didn't need to be named, the kind that tells you you're in the right place, speaking the truth in the right way. When I got home, the daylight had thinned into that pale evening tone that softens the corners of everything it touches. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the 2 boxes waiting beside the table. They looked small compared to the life I'd lived in these walls, but not insufficient. Just distilled. I walked to the closet and began pulling the last of my clothes from the hangers. The fabric whispered against my skin as I folded each piece with measured care. A sweater I'd worn through 2 winters. A simple blouse that always made me feel quietly certain. I placed them into the box without ceremony. The apartment didn't feel like it was emptying. It felt like it was exhaling, letting go of the clutter, the noise, the expectations that had soaked into the corners over the years. I worked slowly, not out of reluctance but precision, like someone sorting through a collection of small truths. Every item placed in the box felt like a quiet punctuation mark, a sentence ending in the right place. I turned to the dresser next, opening each drawer with the same deliberate rhythm I'd used earlier. Socks folded into soft pairs. A handful of letters I'd written and never sent. A tiny ceramic dish holding the earrings I reached for when I needed steadiness more than style. I set aside a few items to donate, the pieces that no longer felt connected to who I was becoming. There was no sentimentality pulling at me, no heaviness. Just a gentle practicality, like clearing out a room before painting it, a necessary step before color returns. Underneath a stack of scarves, I found a small notebook filled with half-started lists. Budget notes, reminders, drafts of conversations I'd never had. I skimmed a few pages, recognizing the version of myself who wrote them. Timid lines, cautious plans. Hopes pressed so lightly onto paper they barely dented the page. I closed the notebook. I didn't need the reminders anymore. The person who wrote them didn't live here now. "I'll take these with me," I said aloud, more to the room than to myself. The words sounded clear, unhurried. They didn't echo. They settled, like they had been waiting to be spoken for some time. I placed the notebook gently into the donation pile and lifted the small stack of documents I'd saved. Employment contract, lease papers, insurance cards. The essentials of a life that could fit neatly into one envelope. Saying it aloud made the decision feel anchored, not fleeing. This wasn't a hurried escape or a last-minute reaction. It was a transition that had been forming quietly beneath the surface for years, finally finding the space to rise. I slid the documents into the second box, aligning them carefully beside the envelopes already organized inside. There was a sense of structure in the arrangement, a shape taking form. Sometimes clarity arrives not in grand declarations, but in the gentle sound of a box closing with purpose. What I felt wasn't excitement, and it wasn't fear. It was something steadier, an inner lining of strength I hadn't recognized until now. The kind that doesn't flare up or fade out, but stays, grounded and constant. I checked the studio address on my phone again, running my finger along the screen as if tracing the outline of a place that would soon hold new quiets, new beginnings. The idea of starting over didn't feel overwhelming. It felt clean. For so long, I'd measured myself against the expectations around me, spoken and unspoken. I'd worried about looking ungrateful, too independent, too distant. I'd tried to fold myself into shapes that fit their comfort. But now, sorting the last items on my shelf, I realized I wasn't stepping away from them. I was stepping into myself. The shift didn't feel loud. It felt correct. A thin draft slipped under the window frame, carrying with it the faint scent of cold air. The curtains swayed slightly, brushing against the stack of folded clothes on the bed. I reached out and steadied the nearest pile with the back of my hand, feeling the soft fabric warm beneath my fingers. The box lids weighted open, catching the glow of the overhead light. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. Every sound felt sharper now, like the room had learned to breathe differently. I tucked the last folded shirt into the corner of the box, pressing it lightly to make space. The cardboard flexed under my touch, sturdy but yielding, ready to carry whatever I placed inside without resistance. These small physical details grounded the moment, making it real in a way paperwork alone never could. Transitions happen in paperwork, but change happens with your hands. The night before the move, my phone buzzed on the countertop, an unfamiliar, quiet vibration that felt heavier than a notification should. I glanced at the screen and saw my parents' number. For a moment, I simply watched the phone glow, the light brushing faintly against the edge of the box beside it. I let it ring twice more before answering. My mother's voice came first, small and hesitant, stripped of its usual certainty. She asked if I had time. She didn't ask where I was. She didn't ask what I was doing. Her question carried something else, an uneasiness she wasn't used to naming. I told her she could speak. There was a pause long enough for me to hear her breath catch slightly, as though she were adjusting to the new shape of our conversations. My father's voice came through next, lower, steadying itself before each sentence. He didn't bring up the boundaries directly, but I heard their outline in every careful word. I leaned against the counter, listening quietly, letting the moment unfold without stepping into old patterns. This wasn't a reconciliation. It was the beginning of a different language. They circled the topic at first, asking if I'd eaten, if I was doing okay, if I needed anything. The old script. But the tone was different, softer. The kind of softness that comes when someone realizes they no longer have the right to assume closeness. They have to earn it. Eventually, my father cleared his throat, the sound faint but deliberate. "We're thinking about what you said," he managed. "Not the boundaries, not the consequences, just what you said." The phrasing wasn't avoidance, it was carefulness. Unfamiliar terrain they were stepping onto one small word at a time. My mother added her own piece. "We didn't realize it felt like that to you." It wasn't an apology yet. It wasn't ownership. But it was acknowledgement. A door opening a few inches instead of staying sealed. I didn't press them. I didn't offer comfort or reassurance to ease the discomfort stirring on their end. I simply listened. Some shifts are too new to touch. "I'm moving tomorrow," I said, my voice even, the words landing gently but unmistakably. The silence that followed wasn't sharp, it was hesitant, like they were absorbing something they hadn't prepared to hear out loud. My mother exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible through the speaker. My father asked where, and I told him the general area, nothing more. No justification, no emotional framing, just information. I didn't fill the silence afterward. I let it settle, giving them space to understand that the decision wasn't symbolic or reactive. It was real, physical, already in motion. Their quiet felt heavier now, but not oppressive. More like they were standing at the edge of a truth that finally demanded stillness. I waited, letting the moment breathe. "I see," my father said at last. Just 2 words, but they landed with a weight that felt like acceptance beginning to take shape. I expected anger or disappointment or a flare of the old tactics, but none came. Instead, there was a kind of subdued steadiness, like they were holding something fragile and trying not to let it slip through their fingers. My mother's voice softened further. "If you need anything," she said, "you can tell us. We'll try to do better about how we speak." It wasn't perfection. It wasn't resolution. But it was a shift, small, cautious, real. I felt no urge to soothe them, no impulse to reassure them that we were okay. The old reflex had been replaced by something quieter, more grounded. Clarity. I didn't want distance out of spite. I wanted space that didn't cost me pieces of myself. "I'll let you know," I answered, steady. Not a promise, not a withdrawal, just truth. And truth, I realized, didn't need embellishment to feel whole. A soft breeze slipped through the cracked window, brushing the edge of a packing label that curled slightly on the box beside me. Outside, a car passed slow enough for its headlights to cast moving shadows across the kitchen tiles, faint and stretched. I rested my hand on the countertop, feeling the cool surface anchor me as the call lingered in the air. The house felt unusually quiet, not empty, just holding its breath. The light from the hallway created a thin, warm line across the floor, catching the corner of the second box where the envelopes lay neatly inside. Everything around me felt poised, like a scene waiting for the next small movement to reveal its direction. On the other end of the line, my parents were silent again, not defensive, not dismissive, just quiet. It was a new kind of quiet, one that didn't demand anything from me. I let it sit. Morning arrived without ceremony. No rush of adrenaline, no second guessing. Just the soft gray light stretching across the floor. I rolled the first box toward the door, its weight shifting gently with each step. The studio address was already saved in my GPS, but I could have found it without directions. I'd memorized the way on my second visit. I slipped on my coat, feeling the fabric brush against my wrists, warm and steady. When the movers knocked, their voices were low and practical, the kind of presence that makes transitions feel simple instead of heavy. They lifted the boxes with efficient care, navigating the narrow hallway without complaint. I watched each box leave the apartment, not as pieces of a life being uprooted, but as containers of what I had chosen to keep, intentional, pared down, mine. The apartment felt lighter with every trip to the truck. The walls seemed to expand slightly, like they'd been holding their breath and were finally releasing it. I glanced around once more. No ache, no regret. just the quiet understanding that this place had carried me as far as it needed to. We drove across town in a slow, steady procession. The movers followed behind my car, their truck rumbling softly, like a muted drumbeat. The city felt unusually calm, traffic sparse, pedestrians bundled in winter layers, storefronts still waking. I rolled down the window an inch, letting the cold air slip across my knuckles. It sharpened my senses, clearing the lingering weight of yesterday. When we pulled into the lot of the new building, I felt the shift immediately. The design was simple, clean lines, pale brick, wide steps leading to the entrance. Nothing grand, nothing flashy, but something about it felt aligned, like stepping into a room where the furniture finally matched the walls. The movers carried the boxes inside while I signed the paperwork at the front desk. The pen moved smoothly across the page, each signature anchoring me a little deeper into the moment. There was no rush. I didn't feel like I was starting over. I felt like I was stepping into something that had been waiting for me quietly. "I'll take it from here," I told the movers, guiding them to place the boxes near the window. My voice sounded calm, certain. They nodded, set the final box down gently, and let the room fall into a new kind of silence once they left. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the bare walls, the soft echo of an empty space, the wide window drawing in pale winter light. It didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt like a draft of the life I'd been trying to write for years, but never had room to begin. I slid my hand along the windowsill, feeling the cool painted wood under my fingertips. The air inside the studio carried a faint scent of fresh plaster and mild detergent, newness in the quietest form. The boxes sat neatly near the corner, waiting without urgency. I breathed in, letting the stillness settle around me like fabric. This wasn't an escape, it was an arrival. I unpacked slowly, not out of hesitation but intention. The essentials found their places first. Toothbrush in the small bathroom, clothes stacked neatly on the single shelf, the kettle on the counter. I moved with a rhythm that felt almost meditative. Open, place, smooth, close. The documents went into the drawer of the small desk near the window, arranged in the same order I had typed and labeled them. Seeing them there, in a space untouched by old narratives or old noise, made them feel cleaner, almost lighter. Every item that settled into its new home felt like a statement. This belongs. This stays. This supports the life I'm choosing. I stepped back and looked around the room. No part of me felt pulled elsewhere, or tethered to where I'd come from. The studio wasn't large, it wasn't elaborate, but it was aligned. Sometimes alignment matters more than square footage. A thin breeze slipped through the cracked window, carrying with it the faint hum of traffic below. The curtain shifted slightly, brushing the side of a box with a whisper-soft sound. I sat on the edge of the mattress, still covered in its protective plastic, and let the cool air trace the edge of my jaw. Light pooled across the floor in a pale ribbon, catching the corner of a folded towel I'd placed on a chair. The room felt open, patient, like it understood the pace I needed to move at. I rested my hands on my knees and leaned forward slightly, grounding myself in the simplicity of the moment. Nothing demanded urgency. Nothing demanded explanation. Just breath, space, and the quiet recognition that I was standing inside a decision fully lived. These small physical details made the transition feel real, in a way no conversation ever could. Quiet anchors truth more deeply than noise. Evening settled gently into the studio, turning the walls a warm, muted gold. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed frame, a cup of water beside me, and the boxes half opened around the room. The day had stretched long but without heaviness, its events landing one by one like soft steps rather than disruptions. I reached for the small envelope of documents, the one holding the timeline from the check to the dismissal, and set it on my lap. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The truth inside it no longer asked for my attention. It simply existed, steady and complete, like a chapter finished with clean margins. For the first time, I felt no urge to rehearse explanations or prepare for doubt. Outside, the city hummed softly, distant engines, the occasional car door, the faint echo of laughter from someone passing below my window. Ordinary sounds, but they felt like signs of a life unfolding around me, not closing in. This wasn't an ending marked by final words. It was an ending marked by stillness, the kind that opens into something else. My phone buzzed once beside me. A single vibration. No insistence, no urgency. I reached for it and saw my parents' names on the screen. Not calling, just sending a short message. "We hope the move went smoothly. Let us know if you need anything." No guilt woven between the lines. No disguised pressure. No rewriting of the past. Just a sentence shaped with caution, as if they were learning how to speak in a new language, one where respect wasn't implied, but practiced. I didn't reply right away, not out of defiance, but because the moment didn't require a response. Their message didn't fix anything. It didn't erase anything. But it acknowledged something quietly. The boundary had landed, and they were choosing to move within its edges for now. I set the phone down gently. Understanding could take its time. I wasn't holding my breath for it anymore. "I'm okay," I said quietly, tasting the truth of the words as they left my mouth. It wasn't a reassurance directed at anyone else. It was a simple observation, a naming of the steadiness that had settled into my body like a slow, warm current. I didn't need a witness for it. I didn't need validation or applause or permission. The room itself felt like enough. I leaned back, letting my shoulders rest fully against the frame, feeling the newness of the space meet the weight of my body without resistance. No part of me was bracing. No part of me was shrinking. The sentence lingered in the air, neither heavy nor triumphant, just true. Sometimes the quietest truths are the ones that stay. I stood and walked toward the window, pressing my palm lightly against the cool glass. From here, the city looked different, wider, calmer, as if the distance itself had rearranged how the streets unfolded. The sky was a soft gradient, slipping from pale blue to early dusk. A single streetlight flickered on, steadying after a moment. For years I'd needed movement around me to feel alive. Needed momentum, noise, reaction. Now the stillness felt spacious, like I'd stepped into a home I didn't know I'd been building piece by piece. I wasn't leaving anything behind. I wasn't escaping anyone. I had simply moved into a space where my own breath had room to exist without negotiation. The view wasn't dramatic, but it was mine, and that was enough. The curtain swayed gently from a soft draft, brushing the side of the nearest box. I knelt beside it and opened the flaps, lifting the top layer of folded clothes. The fabric felt warm from the day's sunlight, faintly holding the room's newness in its fibers. I placed each piece into the small dresser one at a time, not rushing, letting the simple movement settle something inside me. The studio was quiet except for the distant hum of the radiator cycling on. The sound wasn't intrusive. It felt like a heartbeat marking the hours. I placed my last sweater into the drawer and pressed it flat with my palm. Every small action felt like a declaration. I'm here. I'm steady. I'm choosing this. Not to prove anything, just because the truth had finally found its place. In the end, nothing exploded. No dramatic confrontation, no slammed doors, no shattered relationships. Just a quiet shift, steady, deliberate, undeniable. The debt that had followed me like a shadow turned out to be nothing more than paper, and the story built around it dissolved the moment the truth was placed plainly on the table. And as I settled into my new space, 4 walls, soft light, a window that opened to a calmer version of the world, I finally understood something that had taken me years to name. Peace doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes, it comes in a simple exhale, in a boundary respected, in a step taken toward a life that finally feels like yours. My parents didn't transform overnight. They didn't deliver perfect apologies. But they approached me differently, carefully, thoughtfully, because the truth had changed the gravity in the room, and I didn't need more than that. I didn't need them to rewrite the past. I only needed the space to build my future without carrying their misunderstandings on my back. If a part of this story resonated with you, tell me in the comments. I read every one. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak softly but land deeply.